to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be looking at IAM, right? We're going to be looking at AWS Identity and Access Management, okay? Now, in the last video, we already created, an IAM user. Okay, in the last video, we created an IAM user already, and then we assigned the administrators, access to the IAM user. But of course, we've not added an MFA, which of course I will leave that to us to, do that on our own. Okay, I've already showed us, how you can do that with the root user. Okay, so for the regular user, all right, I believe you should be able to do that on your own. Now, in the last video also, we talked about, creating an account alias, which makes it easy for you to log in to your console anytime just using the name instead of remembering, the account ID, right? The account ID is, it's numbers, of course, but I mean, putting that or remembering that can be a little bit challenging. But with the account alias, it's easier, all right, to remember the account alias, and then you put your username, you put your password, and you're able to log in. Now, today, we want to basically look at what really is IAM, and of course, we want to understand certain things, all right, about the IAM. Now, the Identity Access Management, all right, service on AWS, it's actually number one, it's a global service. All right, because I mean, if you look at it here, you can see that you have, so here you have, different regions where you have, the AWS cloud available. All right, these are different regions in the US, all right, in the Asia Pacific and all of that. Okay, now just to let us know, for some of us who may be wondering, what a region is, what is a region basically? Now, a region basically is just a geographical location, all right, where AWS has a presence. Okay, that is what a region is, a geographical location where AWS has a presence, which means if you go to that region, all right, they have, let's say they have an office, right, in that particular region. So that's what a region is. Now, in each of these regions that you see here, they now have what you call availability zones. All right, in each of the region. So availability zone basically means, all right, data centers. So which means, for example, AWS is available in the US East region, right? But in that US East region, they now have what you call availability zones. So you can see availability zones as maybe branches, all right, of an organization. Okay, you can see it like that. Or you can see it as maybe something like a state and a local government, or maybe a state and then maybe a county, or maybe a district and things like that, basically. All right. So there's a region and there's availability zone. So in each of the regions, you have AZs, all right, or availability zones. Now, in each of these availability zones, okay, you have your normal networking, you have your servers deployed, all right. It's basically a data center, right? So now each of these data centers are actually apart, right? They are not in the same physical, all right, location. Okay, they are at distinct locations within that region. All right. So for example, in the US East, right, the North Virginia region, they might have maybe in the east-west of the North Virginia region, they can have a data center. All right, in the southern part of the North Virginia region, they can have another data center. But one thing about a region is that every availability zone in a region is actually connected together through a fiber optic network. All right, they are logically connected. Of course, they are apart. Now, the reason why they are separated, the reason why they are not in the same location is basically for redundancy, for high availability. Because I mean, something can happen in a particular AZ, right? And then, of course, it shouldn't affect another data center within that region. Okay, so if something happens to AZ1 in North Virginia, then the other AZs in North Virginia, all right, are basically isolated from that, issue. Okay, so anybody who has their resource deployed in other availability zones, they can still continue to use, all right, their services. Okay, so there's a region and then there's an availability zone. Okay, now there are services on AWS that are basically global services, and there are services that you have to create in a particular region. All right. So there are global services and there are what? There are regional services. Okay. Now, the IAM that we have here, it's actually a global service. Okay. It's a global service. So which means if you create a user here, all right, on this particular dashboard, now, even if you are using another region entirely, right, you don't have to create a user in that region again. Which means any user you create here, right, can use resources in any region. Okay, that's what it means by global. So any user that I create here, okay, can access any resources in any region. Okay, so which means if I create my user, all right, maybe let's say I'm using Node-Virginia, that's where my EC2 instances or other things are deployed. Now I don't need to go to Node-Virginia to create a user. I don't need to create a user for, all right, for EU West, London, for example. I don't need to create a user for Ohio, for example, right? A user that is created here can be, all right, can use any resource in any region. Okay, so that's one thing that we must understand. Now let's talk about, all right, we have users. Okay, so we already created a user here, and then we have roles, we have policies, we have identity provider, we have account settings. All right, so let's take a look at, all right, we have user groups as well. So let's take a look at, some of these things, all right, in great detail. Now, if I click on users, all right, if I click on users, now here, a user is basically more like, an entity, right? Somebody who can log in into your system and, do certain things within your system depending on the permissions and the policy attached to their profile. All right. So a user, it's anybody, right, that can log in into the system and perform certain action based on the permissions assigned to their profile. All right. So you can see a user as an employee, all right, in this case, right? Now, every employee, of course, you have to identify with an organization. Now, the fact that you're identifying with that organization, let's say you work with organization X, for example, right? Now, the fact that you work with organization X does not mean, all right, that you have every right and privileges to do whatever you want to do within, all right, that organization, right? What you can do is determined by your, all right, your designation. Is determined by the responsibilities assigned to your profile. Okay, so for example, somebody who is just maybe a secretary, for example, right, will not have as much power as somebody who is maybe, all right, maybe the chief operation officer or the chief financial officer. Okay, somebody who is the group managing director, all right, of course, will have much more power than somebody who is a director, all right, heading a particular division. Okay, so on AWS, when you create a user, all right, you have to assign permissions to the user relative to what that user will be doing within, all right, your system. Now, there is a principle, all right, that is called the principle of least privilege, which basically means when you are giving permission to a user, you are basically restricting what that user can do based on what the user, all right, is actually, all right, able to do. Which means if you have a user that should be able to manage your VPC or your EC2 instance, for example, right? That user should not do beyond that, which means the permission the user will have should not allow the user to do beyond just that. Okay? So for example, somebody who is just, supposed to maybe upload something to your S3 bucket, for example, right? The person does not need, all right, a permission that will allow them to delete files, for example. Okay, so the only permission they should have is the ability to do what? To upload files. That's all. So that is basically what the principle of least privilege is about, which means if this person is supposed to do 1, 2, 3 tasks, then the permission they should have should not, or I should limit them, all right, to just the 1, to the 2, all right, or to the, just to the 3 tasks, all right, they are supposed to do within the system. Okay, so that is basically the principle of least privilege. All right, now when you come to AWS and you click on create users, now there are different ways, all right, to authenticate with your AWS platform, depending on, all right, what you're trying to do and how you intend to interact with the AWS services and resources. Right now, for example, I can come here and put a username here. So I can come here and say I want to create a user called DevOps, for example. Now, if you look at this place, it says provide user access to the AWS management console is what? Is optional, which means there are certain users that shouldn't have console access, or there are certain users that you don't need console access to use them. Okay? There are certain users like that. So which means access to the console is actually optional. It doesn't mean that every user you create on AWS should have access to the console. right? Now you can create a user which basically the credential that user will be using is basically what you call access key and secret key. Now that is a user that want to interact with AWS programmatically or through the command line. Okay, because I mean, apart from accessing your AWS account through the console, you can also access your AWS account through the CLI or through SDK, which is programmatic access, right? Which means you can access your AWS environment through other tools, right, that will interact, all right, with AWS on your behalf. Okay, so there are users that will have console access, there are users that will have CLI access, which means command line access. Now, a good example is, for example, if you're trying to launch, all right, you're trying to create resources on AWS using Terraform, for example. I'm sure some of us have heard about Terraform, right? It's an infrastructure as code tool that you can use to create resources, all right, on AWS. Okay. Now, when you're trying to use Terraform to create resources on AWS, it actually leverages your CLI credential, all right, to do, all right, the resources, to create the resources, all right, on AWS. Okay, your Terraform is not going to log in through the console to create the resources. It is going to use your credentials through the command line, all right, to create resources on the AWS platform. Okay, so you can have a user that has console access, you can have another user that has CLI access. Now, the way they are going to log in onto the AWS platform, of course, is going to be different, definitely. Okay, one will have, all right, a username and a password to log in, and of course, it can also have an MFA, all right, to log in. Another user who would basically access your AWS environment through the CLI will have what you call access key, all right, and secret key. Now, the access key, it's more like a username. The secret key is more like a password. But in this case, all right, they are not accessing through the console. They are accessing through the CLI, the command line, okay, programmatically. All right, if you want to put it that way. Is that okay? So you have different ways by which you can access your AWS platform. Now, a user can also have both access, right? Which means you can have a user that has console access and you can have a user that also has, all right, CLI access. In fact, you can have a user that has both accesses, okay? And we're going to see that as we go on. All right, so let's create this user. So I'm going to say console access for now, and I'm going to come here to say I want to create an AWS. All right, so I'm going to create an IAM user. Okay, that's what I'm going to select here. Now here, I can auto generate a password, all right, if I don't want to stress myself. So let me just say auto generate password. And then here, I'm going to check this to say that, this user should actually change their password on the next sign in. Okay, I don't want to give them any password, all right. I want them to change their own password themselves, all right, so that if anything happens with their account, they can take responsibility, all right, for that. Is that okay? So I'm going to click and I'm going to say next. Now, when you're creating a user, you can add a user to a group. You can create a user just, as a user, all right, and you can attach a policy directly to a user. But for now, let's just go and say next, all right. I just want to show us something. So I'm just going to say next, and I'm going to say create user. Now, this user has been created. Now you can see the sign-in URL is making a lot more sense, right? This is the alias, all right, that we've created in the last video. And then this is the username and this is the password. Okay, so I can show the password to you. Of course, after the video, I'm going to delete it anyway. All right, and then you can see the password that was also generated. Okay, now what I want to show us is this. So let me try to log in with this new user that we just created. So I'm going to put in my alias, all right, and then the username we just created is DevOps. And of course, I need to put in the password. All right, so the password, I'm going to grab that and I'm going to put that here. Remember, the policy, or we checked, something that says the user should change the password, all right, at the next login, right? So I'm going to click on sign in and it's going to take me to this page. Now you can see here that alias was resolved back, all right, to the account ID. Okay, so the old password, I'm going to put that here and I'm going to specify a new password, all right? Okay. And then I'm going to say confirm password change. Now I have, all right, changed the password of this user. Now this user now is able to log in, all right, onto my system. Is that okay? Is able to log in to the system. But then look at what you have here. All right, look at what you have. It says access denied, right? I mean, the user practically can do anything. Okay, I mean, if I go to services, for example, and I come here and I type in IAM, all right, IAM, for example, and I open that up. Now, look at what you're going to have here, all right? Now, here you are seeing what? Access denied everywhere. Okay, now what is the cause of this access denied? Now, when you create a user on AWS, right? If you've not assigned a permission to that user, the user is only, all right, an authenticated user. Okay, now when you take a look critically, all right, at this thing here, which is IAM, identity, access, and management. Now, that also relates to what you have in security that is called the triple A, which is authentication, authorization, and accounting, right? Now, when you have a user created for the first time, that user is regarded as an authenticated user, which means the user identifies with the system. The user has a right credential on the system. Okay? But the user is not authorized until, okay, a permission is assigned. Now, when somebody gets a job for the first time, right? For example, when you go for an interview and then you get a job, right? You go for the interview, you pass the interview, and then they send you a message to say, congratulations, you have been offered an appointment with XYZ company. Now, that is basically what authentication is. That message in itself does not mean that you have authority to do certain things within that organization just yet. Until you've gone through certain maybe trainings, some onboarding sessions, and all of that, and then they assign a portfolio to you that defines what you can now do within the company. Is that okay? So there's authentication. So this user that we created now is an authenticated user, which means the user is part of the system. We are aware that this user is now a member of the system, but we have not authorized this system just yet. And that is where the access in the IAM comes in. So this user has an identity, but does not have access. Do you understand that now? So the user has what? An identity, but does not have access just yet. And that is why you can see all of these access denied. So what do we do? Now, in terms of access, access is also defined by what the user, all right, is able to do within the system. So if you employed somebody to come and be, all right, maybe the front desk person, now the access you're going to give to that person will be limited based on that job role, which means the person is not able to do something that maybe a manager would do or maybe a supervisor would do. Because I mean, in front desk, if you have your role clearly defined, you may not be able to do beyond maybe just receiving incoming mails, dispatching mails, all right, noting down maybe visitors in the organization and things like that. Okay, so access here does not mean that we're going to give this user a right to do anything within our system. No, the access is going to be limited to what the user is expected to do within the system. All right, so let's go ahead and let's give this user some access. Okay, and let's see how that is done. So if I click on this user here, all right, so if I click on the user, I can see permissions. All right, oops, sorry, that's not the user. All right, this user. So click here. So if I click on the user, I can see permissions, I can see groups, I can see tags, security credentials, and all of that. Now, the only permission that this user has is basically IAM user change password, which means the user can change, all right, his or her password by themselves, right? They don't need the administrator to do that for them. Is that okay? Now, if I want to assign a permission to this user, how do I do it? Because I mean, it's saying access denied. So what can I do? Now, let's assume that this user, all right, has been employed to manage IAM, for example. So we've employed this user to be able to just maybe, let's say read, okay, users that we have within the system. Well, we want the user to just have access to read. Remember, I said read. which means I only want this user to view, all right, just, the IAM section alone, just the IAM section, right? I want them to get familiar, all right, with the IAM section and not any other thing. I don't want them to delete any user. I don't want them to be able to create users, all right, and I don't want them to be able to interact with any other service, all right, within the system. I just want this user to do IAM read, which means just take a look at the users that we have and then just take some notes and say, oh, we have this user, we have that user, these are the permissions assigned to them, and all of those kind of things. That is just what I want this user to do. So what do? So on the user tab, I can come here and click here to add permission. So if I click here to add permission, there are two different ways to add permission. So one is add permission, and the other one says create inline policy. Now, let me quickly talk about the difference between the two. Now, when you create an inline policy, right, the inline policy will be available as long as this user is still within the system. Okay? Which means if you create an inline policy, the inline policy is tied to the lifespan of this user. Which means the day I delete this user, the policy will also be deleted. Okay? That is what inline policy means, which means the policy is attached to that user. So the moment the user is deleted, the policy also goes. That is what inline policy means. Okay? But then a more general way to assign permissions is to click on add permissions. All right. Now you can decide to add the user to a group. We're going to touch on group later. You can copy permission from somewhere, or maybe from another user. You can copy the permission from another user, or you can attach permissions directly. All right. Now, under this permissions tab or policies tab, okay, you have different kinds of permissions too, basically, right? There's the AWS managed permissions, and there's what you call the customer managed permissions. Now we're going to delve into, all right, creating permissions, how to create your own permissions. If you don't want to use, all right, the default permission, provided to you by AWS, maybe there are certain things, you want to check and all of that, you just want to create your own permission. Of course, you can do that. But that kind of permission is called a customer managed permission, which means you have control over that permission. But these ones that you see here with this AWS logo, it is basically AWS managed, which means you can only use this permission as is. You can't modify these permissions, right? You can only use them, all right, the way they are. You can actually manage them, all right. You can modify it. Okay. So here I'm going to come here and I'm going to say, well, I want this user to be able to just read, anything IAM. So I'm going to come here and then here I see IAM read only access. Okay. So that means this user will be able to read the IAM section, or view the user that we have in our organization, check their profiles, check, their permissions and all of that, and will not be able to do any other thing. So let me assign that. So I'm going to check here. I'm going to click on next, and then I'm going to say add permission. Okay. Now let's go back to our user, all right, and refresh. Now, if I come here and I refresh this user, now all of those access denied, you can see that it's basically disappeared. All right, it's disappeared. So now I can see my IAM dashboard. All right, I can see the number of users I have. I can see the roles. I can see that I don't have any policy created just yet. All right, and then I can see the alias. I can, all right, come here. I can see a whole lot of things on this dashboard. But remember, this user has been assigned IAM read only permission, nothing. Okay, IAM read only. That's what this user has. All right. Now, let's say that this user wants to, do something, right? Just thinking, they can do whatever they want to do and all of that. So let's say this user wants to create a user. So I'm going to click on create user. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, oh, if this user has read-only access, why is the user creation page displaying? It should have shown error. Okay. Now, watch this. So let's say we want to create a test user. All right. The DevOps user is trying to create a test user. So I'm just going to say next. I'm just going to say next. I'm just going to say create user. All right. Now look at what you see here. It says user DevOps is not what? Authorized. Right? Which means we recognize your identity, we know you are part of the system, but you are not authorized to perform IAM create user on this particular resource because no identity-based policy allows the IAM create user action. Can you see that? So it is true that this user is identified within the system, but the authority that this user has is limited to certain things. And that's why you can see the error here, saying this account is not what? Authorized. Right? So that is basically what IAM is. So identity, you create a user, access, all right, granting access, defining what users can do within your system. Management is basically, all right, monitoring, all right, what the user has done, all right, or what they've done over time. And that is the last part of the triple A, which is accounting, right? Basically, you keep a record of what users are doing within your system. Okay, so that is basically what IAM is about. So it's a place, it's a global service, all right, and it's also a platform where we create users, assign permissions to them, all right, is a place where we determine what can be done within the system, what can't a user do, all right, and basically we define the boundary, all right, of what our users are able to do within our system. All right. So in the next video, I'm going to show you how you can create your own policies, right? If you want to, create some granular policies, right? You don't want to use the AWS managed policy. You want to create your own policies, right? I'm going to show you exactly how to do that. And I'm going to show you how to do what you call account settings. All right. And then we look at groups, all right, as well. Okay. So thank you so much once again for joining me today. All right, I will see you in the next video, all right, when we talk about all these other things. All right, and of course, just to mention here, we're still going to be touching on other things, right? We're going to be touching on other services, and then we're going to do, all right, a project that would help us to tie together all of the things that we're going to be learning, all right, on the AWS platform. Okay, so thank you so much. Don't forget to subscribe, don't forget to like, and don't forget to share the videos. All right, I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.